I promised when I did this presentation, and I prepared it last week, that I wasn't going to talk about poppy, because everyone's heard about poppy and is sick about it. And then the regulator, in a cruel twist of fate, announces a commencement date potentially on April Fool's Day over the weekend. So all I will say about poppy, to keep it brief, because you've all heard about poppy many times before, is that you recall when the Consumer Protection Act came out, every consumer, for every grievance they had, became a consumer protection lawyer overnight and would Google the act and shove a section in your face. One can anticipate similar things about poppy, especially as internationally the business standard goes towards safeguarding of data and consumer expectations in that regard. I can also promise you, Alistair, we have read the act very carefully as well. So moving on beyond that, onto the biggest developments for us in this space. Sorry, my point is gone. The things we've noticed recently is things becoming a service. So increasingly, ownership, the concept we understand is you own assets, you own your software, you own whatever it may be. That is increasingly no longer the case. It is now a service, it's now a license you obtain, as well as a maintenance contract. So again, you will see this from all your software suppliers, and you may yourselves be providing this service onwards to customers, but we are seeing an increasing, not pushback, but a realization among consumers that in fact they don't own the music they stream on Apple Music and on Spotify, and increasingly there's then pushback and recourse towards the terms that consumers sign. And you will all know that in the past, legal terms are extremely long, they're extremely dense, they cover you in every conceivable way, and consumers are increasingly expecting a more ethical or a more, I suppose, even set of consumer terms. So I can speak personally if in the last year or so of my practice, I can't say offhand, maybe 20 or 30 existing legally valid, as it were, terms and conditions have had to be reworked just to optically align with where the market is going. It's very hard to hold yourself out as a consumer-friendly business if in the event of this dispute you drop a 30-page size 10 aerial document on people and say, no, tough, please comply. And the same, of course, will also apply to privacy policies. Another thing that we've noticed, and it's becoming quite an exciting development, is smart contracts. So for those of you who may not know, our law of contract is essentially derived from Roman Dutch law hundreds of years ago. And I suppose the exciting thing about South African law is that because we are principles-based, we don't have to, and for many things, we don't have to look at an act and go, can smart contract do 1, 2, 3? We take our existing principles and we move forward. So we can actually quite rapidly accommodate this type of development in our law. And in many cases, our law is actually able to move quickly through the courts as opposed to Parliament having to caucus and deliberate on these things. So increasingly, we're excited by what we see from our customers coming through with smart contract proposals for derivatives trading, for example, aligned to that, unique implementations of mobile wallets. As earlier speakers have mentioned, there's one thing to introduce a mobile wallet, there's another thing to introduce an uptake to that wallet. So there's been exciting developments, especially in the lower income markets, for how many brands are trying to position themselves and how they reach out to lower income consumers. And then a final thing, I won't go into too much detail, obviously, on artificial intelligence, and I think Carla speaks to this as well, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, then I won't go into that because we're a bit limited time. The final, most important thing that I was going to speak about before Poppy came into force over the weekend, apparently, was the Media Films Publication, or the Film and Publications Board is a body that has historically regulated movies we see at the cinema, movies maybe we hire, and the books we read, and newspaper publications. ACASA was always a regulator that dealt with things you see online. But there was always a very large gap because ACASA doesn't get involved on what you see online. They just care about how it gets there. And the Film and Publications Act never really gave the board any power to interfere with what you see online. And that gap has now been plugged. And the reason it's been plugged is that the big guys like Netflix, Amazon Video, they don't care what South African laws say. They make the platform available. When a consumer uptake is there, they see a gap in the law and they say we're not going to pay any fees or subject ourselves to your oversight. This is what it is. And there was no legal mechanism to hold them to account. What's happened now is we swung quite far the other way, in that this act now regulates what we call commercial distributors, so your Netflixes, your YouTubes, etc., as well as non-commercial distributors, such as you and I who make YouTube videos. So a key thing to think when you operate any kind of online presence, you push any kinds of games or films or run any kind of ad campaign or YouTube campaign, you must now also bear in mind that the Film Publications Board now has jurisdiction over those activities, and we're yet to see exactly how they will exercise that jurisdiction. But amongst regulators, some of their decisions have been very controversial in recent years. And so that'll be a very interesting thing to watch to see how they address it. Personally, I think they're going to start with the bigger fish first, obviously Netflix and the Amazon videos, the traditional broadcasters in the streaming video space. But increasingly, you'll find people can complain saying, I find this adverts being streamed from a retailer's website as being objectionable. And instead of going to the advertising regulatory board or whatever the body may be, you now have a second body who may exercise some kind of jurisdiction there and pull down a video saying it's hate speech or it implies violence or discrimination, etc. Really, for me, that's all the big developments. And then to hand over to Carla.
So what I will be focusing on more is the brand strategy or IP strategy that you need to adopt in a digital type of world. So that your IP or brands are protected and can be enforced. So the legal considerations of your brand strategy can't be seen in a vacuum anymore. You have to consider these things collectively and not just as a business imperative, but also to protect your brand and the value of your brand. So because there are so many moving parts to a good IP strategy, you need to decide this upfront before you actually go to market. And you also can't focus only on your primary market or the first market in which you launch your product in. You need to think about where it is you're going in the future, because those kinds of, the considerations that apply here don't necessarily apply in other jurisdictions. So what might be important in your primary market, let's say it's South Africa, from a regulatory perspective may not apply in Uganda or in some other country that you want to go to market in. So these kinds of considerations need to be dealt with upfront. So as I said, the key focuses of a good IP strategy in a digital world don't only look at IP registrations. So in other words, registering your trademark and thinking that that's your brand strategy done and dusted will be enough to help you enforce your rights. It's not. You have to, of course, think about IP registrations, but that also includes other forms of IP, like domain names. You can effectively use domain names as a defensive trademark strategy, and it also increases foot traffic to your website, so it has a dual purpose. The other things that you can consider in terms of registration is patents and designs, depending on the nature of your product. And again, that's important from a territorial perspective, because not every country treats those types of rights in the same manner. The other thing that becomes very important is what are the commercial considerations? How are you taking your product to market? What distribution channels will you be using? If you are using different distribution channels, what types of contracts do you need to protect your intellectual property rights and leverage your brand and obviously commercialize your brand effectively, not just in your primary market, but in all of the markets that you intend playing in. The other important factor is exchange control and how the South African exchange control regulations influence how it is that you would structure your brand. And the reason why that is so important is because any outward licensing or sale of your intellectual property to an unrelated or related offshore entity requires approval from the Reserve Bank. And that becomes particularly important where it is that you're gearing your business to obtain debt or equity funding, or to use your intellectual property to, for example, get security from a bank. And so those factors need to be taken into account upfront. Another important consideration is tax, and what would the tax position be if you did, for example, sell your IP offshore? Is it a capital gain? And in which entity's hands would there be a gain? And then, of course, also you could benefit from knowing how your intellectual property fits into the tax regime generally, because there are rebates that you can get, for example, for R&D in South Africa. So exploring all of those things up front is really important so that you leverage your brand and your intellectual property in a commercial way that makes sense up front and not once you've already missed the bus. So all of these things that you would put into a brand strategy are important, not just from a business perspective, but also from enforcing your rights perspective in all of the jurisdictions that you will operate in, especially because the world is now a very digital one, and most of your businesses are being conducted not only in the traditional sort of markets, but also online. And a lot of the trends that businesses are facing that pose threats to brands and to intellectual property are things like data breaches. You know, everybody considers a data breach and thinks like, how am I supposed to comply under POPI and so on, but you also need to consider what impact that breach would have on your brand and how it is you're going to manage your reputation in the market from a brand perspective. So you also need to have a plan, of course, about the legal POPI type steps that you would take to rectify those breaches, but of course, how are you going to recover your brand value where things like a data breach have occurred. Another one is AI and machine learning. So it's obviously super cool technology that people can employ in their retail businesses or in any other business actually. But in future, we anticipate seeing AI starting to develop intellectual property on its own. Currently, you know, organizations or the people that build AI are in control of what these platforms can do. They feed them the information that is required. But there are already pieces of AI out there that can do things that are entirely novel, like write poetry or play songs, invent the song without human interaction. And the real issue becomes who owns the intellectual property in those kinds of productions. Because our laws were written so long ago, they're outdated and quite frankly obsolete when it comes to trying to figure out things like who would own something that's created by an AI platform. Another one of the trends is parody. So parody is obviously awesome and really funny and can be great for a brand, but it can also be devastating to the value of a brand if it's not properly managed. And the more parody, I mean, it's obviously very common in the US, but the more parody is being used here in South Africa. For example, I'm sure you've all seen the Woolworths parody page, it's really funny, but at some point, it could potentially become something that needs to be closely managed because the person that's controlling that parody account is not related to your business. They say what they think, and that can have a detrimental impact on your brand. Another thing is that oftentimes you can't really enforce trademark laws or advertising standards against the parody accounts because they are on social media platforms, and you then have to comply with their takedown regulations or, for example, in Facebook's case, their community standards, which don't always align with South African legal principles. The last sort of trend is, it's definitely not new. Counterfeiting and infringement have existed ever since we've had products that can be counterfeited or infringed. But taking it into a digital world has kind of elevated the issue. And it's because it's become a global problem, it's very difficult to enforce your rights if you don't have a proper IP and brand strategy in place. Many of the countries, for example, throughout the African continent, don't have comprehensive anti-counterfeiting legislation, and enforcing your brands in those kinds of scenarios can be quite difficult to do. And then, of course, there are other ways. You can, for example, have websites taken down and so on. But the real issue that we're seeing going forward is, great, we can take websites down, but they don't necessarily stay down. Within a day or two, they back up. The counterfeit or infringing behavior is continuing, and it's a constant battle monitoring how it is your brands are being exploited by other people in the market. So you have to come up with a really good way of managing these risks to make sure that your rights are protected and your brand value is maintained. So we do have a copyright amendment bill that is really bad, so we really hope it doesn't go ahead. But the whole premise of that bill was supposed to be to make the bill or the new act tech neutral, so that it doesn't matter if any kind of really fancy cool new tech comes up, the act would still apply. And to some degree it has done that, but it's just unfortunately fraught with so many other issues that we hope it doesn't go through in its current form. But yes, we definitely, the legal world is trying to come up with ways of how it is we legislate in an era where most of the things that we use today will be obsolete by the time the legislation comes into place. So they are trying to come up with ways of how to create legislation in a manner that's not obsolete by the time it becomes in force.
I just want to share a couple of things, and I realize, look, this is really late in the day. A lot of things have been said. I just, I like to keep things simple. If you're wondering, that is me. That is how I try to encourage my internal customers. I dressed up like this, flew down to Durban on SAA. They were still flying in those days. Dressed up like this. I then had time to kill, so I walked to the B field of Moses Mabhida, Kings Park. They're all in close vicinity. Those people thought I was the entertainment of the day. The sharks were actually exercising, practicing, whatever there. And people came up to me, not kids, grown-ups. Can I please have a picture with you? It's for my children. Yeah, right. So the title is actually, how incredible is your customer service? How incredible do your customers experience you actually? So, is your heart beating for your patients, or is my heart beating because I'm standing here? So that is what CX is all about. It's lots of terminology, but just a couple of points. So we've heard about disruption. Disruption it's a given. It is out there, and especially at retail level. Your customers are always on. Now somebody mentioned, I think Alistair, I can't remember who, just have a look at people and their phones. They walk with their phones. I don't want to pick on anybody if it's more female or male, but it's definitely younger people. They're always on the phone. Some people touch their phone not only once an hour, it gets into 500, 600 times a day. So if you do that, if you have an iPhone and you've activated that, your phone will tell you your screen time is up or down by 30% and you've been on it for 3 hours. It should say something. So why aren't you there for your customers? Just have a quick look, 1 minute. In that minute, this is what your customers are actually doing in that minute. So the younger people especially, while they're watching TV, they're downloading YouTube videos. They are buying stuff online. We heard earlier they might be WhatsApping somebody as well. So that's all in that internet minute. That's what your customers are doing. So how do you break into that clutter? How do you get to talk to them? And if they don't come to your store, well, you've got a problem. If they can't find you online, if you don't have a good presence online, then what? Are you relying on something? Then have a look at this. So this is my second point, is if you have a look at what your customers think is important. Now, please also bear in mind that we think our customers, we're actually engaging with them. I've got a cool website, my store is okay. So 70 to 80% of companies thought their consumers like what they have. The consumers, on the other hand, more than 80% thought it was rubbish. So a lot of customer-related information is on there. What they like, and service is important, online as well as in the actual store. So what is CX all about? What would you need to do? And as I said just now in the panel, if I can only reach 1 or 2 people and you have a look at these kinds of things, do you have a strategy for CX that is in place? Or is it just some lonely ranger who's called the chief information officer, or like me, a digital lead, or whatever you want to call it, and it actually permeates through the company? You have buy-in from top management down to every last person. Do you have an actual strategy in place, for instance? Customer call centers, man, they are sometimes a real piece of work. So just a quick story. So last year I became Mrs. K. McDonald. Now you have your program in front of you, you know what my name is. I'm not Mrs. K. McDonald, but I started receiving SMSs from a large retailer, a clothes retailer in this country. First of all, your balance of your account is so-and-so. You have 5,000 Rand to spend. The latest fashion is in store. Please contact us. There's no contact number. So I go onto their website, and I was really battling to get hold of them. There's nothing. So eventually I get a phone number. I phone them. Put on hold. Eventually, it's on my cell phone. It's my cost. Put it down. I write an email. To this day, nothing. So eventually I get hold of somebody. I explain my predicament. I'm not Mrs. McDonald, but I keep getting her stuff on my number. But you know, sir, it's a problem. Now her name is linked to your cell phone. How are we going to find your number in all our customers and take your information off? Have you not heard of Excel at least? You know, you can filter these things. Just after I hung up the phone, I get in succession, well, one day apart, I get phone calls from their customer, from their call center. Hello, I want to speak to you. I said, sorry, who am I speaking to? No, so-and-so. Said, oh, I'm glad you're phoning me. I'm trying to get phone down. Next one phones me. So please take me off your list. Phone down. So just an explanation of this is what it can happen. So guess what I said? Hello, Peter. You all know what Hello, Peter is, I take it. Okay. So, but that's not what you want. You want to move on. So I'm just going to skip that one. I would like to actually get to this point and then I'm done. This is very late. Guys, just think about the touch points that your brand, you, your company, the retailer, whatever, have with your customers. It starts before they purchase. They then come into your store or they buy online, whatever the case may be. What is that interaction? What is that touch point? Do they stand around the braai or do they visit people and talk about your terrible service? Or do they WhatsApp the group? I'm on various groups at work and in the community. Or do they WhatsApp those and say, listen guys, that service was excellent. And afterwards, when they phone you back, so please tell us about your service. So I moved, and some people might think I'm stupid, but I moved from BMW to Toyota. Wow, big gap, big jump. I can tell you now, their service that I received since I bought that car has been streets better than the BMW dealership I used to deal with. And I told them that. I wouldn't have told them that. So all I'm saying, guys, is take small steps, be brave, just do it. Start somewhere in your company and work your way up and think of what your customers actually mean to you, what they want. You are all customers when you not in your organization. It's a little hobby because of doing this kind of thing. I go into a lot of shops and I actually test all these kinds of things. And it's obvious it's not happening. So take some small steps, but move ahead, move forward, and just implement decent customer service. Thank you.
Thank you.